The Vakarath called it the stillness instrument. That is a translation. The original term in their primary diplomatic register is a compound noun that carries no direct equivalent in standard coalition, though the closest rendering the linguistics division ever agreed on, and linguists rarely agree on anything, which tells you something about the difficulty of the original, was something between the condition of having been made quiet and the state of no longer being a problem. They did not consider those two meanings to be in tension. They did not appear to notice that a reasonable person might find them in tension. That gap between what the Vakarath intended by the phrase and what a human being understood when reading it tells you nearly everything you need to know about the Vakarath dominion, and it tells you nearly everything you need to know about what came after. My name is Dr. Cassiel Oren. I am a weapons systems engineer. I hold a doctorate in applied field resonance mechanics from the Coalition Polytechnic at Vela Station, which is a credential that sounds more dramatic than it is. Most of what I spent the first 12 years of my career doing was cataloging alien power cell architectures and writing detailed reports about materials bonding techniques that found their way into semi-annual summary documents that no one read in full. I worked for the Coalition's Integrated Defense Science Directorate in the Recovered Technology Assessment Division, which was the department responsible for examining non-coalition hardware obtained through trade agreements, salvage licensing, and decommissioned material exchanges, and producing from that hardware a threat assessment that informed the Directorate's modeling of potential adversary capabilities. It was useful and important work that was almost entirely invisible, because the useful and important work of maintaining a comprehensive picture of what everyone around you is building tends to produce results that are stored rather than acted upon, filed and updated and refined until the day they turn out to matter. That day, for me, was the 14th of compact year 2291. I was in my office at the Directorate's primary facility on Meridian Station. It was an ordinary morning. I had a cup of coffee from the commissary that was slightly too hot to drink, and I was letting it sit while I worked. Through a materials analysis on a fragment of Karathi hull plating that had come in with the previous month's salvage shipment. The fragment was unremarkable. My notes reflected that. At 0847 station time, my terminal flagged a priority advisory routed from the Signals Monitoring Division to all department heads in the Directorate, with a secondary forward list that included senior technical staff. I was on that list because my department head, Director Yael Adu, had added me to it 18 months earlier on the grounds that someone she trusted needed to be reading the raw feed whenever anything significant came through, because the summaries lost too much. The message was 8 lines of formatted data, signal signature, novel, no catalog match. Event duration, 19 minutes across all affected zones. Affected zones, 38 separate star systems, all human settled. Preliminary assessment, wide area biological effect of unknown mechanism, non-lethal classification pending full medical review. Casualty estimates, pending. Telling me she was in an emergency session with the Secretary of Defense's office and needed me reading the raw feed directly and flagging anything live technical that needed immediate escalation. I told her I was already reading it. She said good and closed the comm, and I was alone in my office with 8 lines of data and a cup of coffee that was now the right temperature and that I did not touch for the next 4 hours. 38 worlds in 19 minutes. No explosive signature. No kinetic impact signature. No radiation type that matched any weapon in our threat assessment library. Whatever had happened, it had passed through planetary atmospheres and surface structures and building materials and everything else between the delivery mechanism and its targets without leaving the kind of marks that weapons leave. What it had left, according to the first medical dispatches that began coming through 2 hours later, was people, living people, breathing, heart beating, metabolically functional people who could not speak and could not recognize the faces of their families and could not hold a thought long enough to act on it. The preliminary figure that came through at 1300 station time was 3,800,000. It was revised upward 3 times in the following 2 weeks as the full survey teams reached all 38 worlds and completed their assessments. The final verified figure, reached 14 days after the event, was 4,142,000. I remember the moment I saw that number finalized in a medical division report, because it replaced the earlier figures in a way that felt definitive. In a way the earlier figures had not. 4,142,000 had an exactness that the round estimates before it lacked. An exactness, in situations like that one, lands differently than approximation. It is harder to hold at arm's length. What the Vakarath Dominion transmitted to the Coalition's Compact Office 6 hours after the deployment was harder still. I received the forward within the hour. Director Adu had given me blanket authorization to read everything that came through the classified diplomatic channel related to the event. The transmission was formatted in the Vakarath's High Diplomatic Register, which their protocol required for formal communications with the Coalition's senior leadership, and it was 3 pages of legal preamble and 1 paragraph of substance. The substance was this: the Vakarath Dominion, pursuant to its sovereign authority under Article 7 null of the Vakarath Trade Compact, and its right of precautionary non-signatory biological reclassification, had designated certain human biological units detected within proximity of Vakarath territorial survey parameters as non-responsive inventory under Vakarath custodial standing, and was notifying the Coalition of this reclassification as required by compact procedure. The notification included a filing reference number. It included a custodial standing registration date. It included a footnote acknowledging that the Vakarath's territorial survey parameters did not, at the time of the deployment, extend to 37 of the 38 affected systems, and noting that the relevant survey data would be updated in the next administrative quarter to reflect the expanded parameters. I read the notification 7 times in the first hour I had it, not because it was obscure or technically complex, because I kept waiting to find the part of it that acknowledged what had been done, the part where the legal language opened onto something recognizable as an awareness of what 4,142,000 people not being able to speak meant, what it meant that their families on other worlds were calling and getting no answer or an answer from a care worker who was trying to find words for something that had no good words. That part did not exist. The notification had been drafted by the Vakarath's legal division, and the legal division had done its job with precision and thoroughness, and had produced a document that was technically complete and entirely untroubled by the gap between what it described and what had actually happened to 4 million people. The Vakarath did not appear to experience that gap as a gap. They appeared to experience it as an administrative distinction between categories of entity, and they had filed the relevant entities in the relevant categories, and the filing was complete, and that was the end of their burden in the matter. The Vakarath diplomatic mission transmitted a follow-up 4 days later, responding to the Coalition's formal protest. The follow-up was also in High Diplomatic Register and was 5 pages long. Its position, stated with considerable legal precision, was that the Coalition's objection to the reclassification was understandable from a cultural standpoint, but was not, under the terms of the compact as currently constituted, legally actionable, and that the Dominion would be willing to convene a working group to discuss potential amendments to the relevant compact articles in the following administrative year. The Coalition's protest had used the word atrocity. The Vakarath's response did not engage with that word. It did not appear in their document at all. I was in Director Adu's office when she read the follow-up. She read it twice, set it down, and was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at me and said, "I need you to clear your calendar for the indefinite future." I said, "How long is indefinite?" She said, "I don't know. Start tonight." She brought me into a conference room on the 17th, 3 days after the follow-up. There were 11 other people in that room when I arrived, some of whom I knew by name, and some of whom I knew by specialty, and some I did not know at all. 2 physicists from the Resonance Applications Lab at the Vela Station Polytechnic, one of whom had worked on the threat assessment for a class of Korathi field effect weapons 5 years earlier, and whose expertise was exactly what this problem needed. A materials specialist, whose name I will not record here because she has asked not to be associated with what came after. A request I understand without fully honoring, because she was essential to everything that followed, and leaving her out of the account would be dishonest in a way I am not willing to be. 6 engineers from various sections of my own division, including one from Naval Systems, who had never worked on anything that wasn't a propulsion unit, and who turned out to have a way of thinking about field coherence propagation that none of the rest of us did. 2 more whose specialties I am not authorized to describe even in the current declassified context. Adu stood at the head of the table and told us we were being seconded to a new division that had no public designation and would not appear in any accessible record, and that our work for the foreseeable future was a single task: understand the stillness instrument, every element of it, the physics of the field, the targeting mechanism, the delivery architecture, the tuning, all of it. She did not tell us what we would do with that understanding when we had it. She did not need to. We had all read the same filing from the Vakarath diplomatic division. We had all read the same preliminary medical reports from the 38 worlds. The room was very quiet and very still, not with uncertainty, but with a particular kind of settled weight, the weight of people who have processed the worst of it already and arrived at a place past the stage where the grief makes noise. 2 of my colleagues had family on those worlds. I did not. I want to note that because it would be easy to let my own coldness on the subject read as something other than what it was, which was not absence of feeling, but the particular disposition that makes you useful for a certain kind of work, the capacity to hold the feeling at a distance from the instruments, to do the precise thing the precise way, to let the anger and the grief and the outrage sit in a room by themselves while you are in another room with the problem. Adu looked at each of us, not inspiring, not rallying, assessing. She was checking for steadiness, for the cold, not the hot. She found what she was looking for. We flew to Null 7 the next morning. Dry Dock Null 7 was not a dry dock in any current operational sense. It had been built as a coalition fleet maintenance and construction facility in the outer orbital zone of a system whose name I am not going to include in this account for reasons that remain operationally prudent, even under the declassification. It had been a functional installation with a crew of some 400, servicing patrol vessels and mid-class warships that operated in that region of the corridor. 4 years before the stillness deployment, it had been decommissioned when a newer and more strategically positioned facility came online closer to the primary trade lane. The decommissioning was complete and orderly, the crew absorbed into the new installation, the equipment inventoried and partly transferred and partly mothballed, the station placed in a low-traffic holding category in the navigation database, which meant it appeared to automated systems as a non-docking hazard waypoint, and to human navigators as something not worth the fuel. Expenditure to visit. No one went there. No one had a reason to. Someone in the Defense Secretary's office had looked at that profile, decommissioned, out of the way, legitimately uninteresting to everyone, and recognized it as exactly what we needed. When our shuttle docked at Null 7, 31 hours after leaving Meridian Station, the station was not what I had expected from a mothballed installation. 2 full research wings were operational. The equipment in Wing A was the type I recognized from the Directorate's own facilities: assessment benches, spectral analyzers, field coherence testing arrays of the kind my division used for recovered hardware work, all of it calibrated and powered and ready. The equipment in Wing B was less familiar. Some of it was coalition military grade. The heavy classification Type 1 had seen in briefing documents but never worked with directly. Some of it was hardware whose origin I could not immediately identify and was told I did not need to identify. A security detail occupied the transit corridors between the wings. They introduced themselves by function, not by name. There were 12 cots in a room off the main research corridor, 1 for each engineer. The commissary was staffed continuously and never ran out of coffee, which I noted as a sign that whoever had organized the station understood the basic operational requirements of what they were asking us to do and had planned accordingly. The material we had to work with was limited in some ways and generous in others. On the limited side, No intact hardware from the instrument's delivery mechanism, no captured Vakarath technical documentation, no cooperative source inside the Dominion. On the generous side, the sensor array recording from the Coalition survey vessel, caught at the edge of the 38th world's affected zone, degraded, partial, but containing a spectral signature of the field at the moment of deployment that was parsable if you had the right analytical tools and the patience to apply them. And on the most generous side of all, the 4,142,000 survivors, whose collective medical data represented, if you understood what you were looking at, the most complete functional map of a novel weapon effect that any research team had ever had access to. 4 million data points, 38 worlds, the full range of human biological variation, every age cohort, every health status, varied atmospheric and gravitational conditions across the target worlds. What the instrument had done to human biology was documented in extraordinary detail across an enormous sample, because 4 million people who survived a weapon effect and can be examined afterward are, from a purely analytical standpoint, an unparalleled source of information about what that weapon did. I want to be precise about that observation, because I am aware of how it sounds. It sounds cold. It was cold. It had to be cold, because the alternative, reading 4 million medical files as a moral event rather than a technical dataset, letting each case be what it was rather than what it told us, was the alternative that produced nothing useful. And we were there to produce something useful. I read those medical files the way I read the sensor recording, as data. The people in those files were people. The data was data. I kept those two things in separate rooms in my thinking and moved between them as the work required. The two fragments of physical hardware recovered from the most heavily affected world were the last element of the material picture. A coalition forensic assessment team had found them on the surface, components that had burned out during the deployment, ground-deployed relay nodes that had amplified the field's coherence across the planetary surface, and then gone dark when their power cycles completed. They were fused and partially vaporized. Under normal circumstances, they would have been too far degraded to tell us much. But the materials specialist, the one who has asked not to be named, had a background in high-temperature field effect debris analysis that was specific enough to be genuinely rare, and she could read those fragments in ways the rest of us could not. She spent the first 3 weeks with them. What she found gave us the architecture of the node's resonance chamber in enough detail to begin building a model of the coherence propagation method. We worked 14 months. I will describe the work, because the work is the thing, not the drama around it. And the work was the kind of sustained, methodical, often frustrating technical effort that produces correct results at the expense of speed and comfort. We allocated the problem by component and by dependency. The field mechanism first, because everything else depended on understanding what the field was physically doing. Then the targeting tuning, because the field's specificity, its precision against human higher neural tissue while passing through everything else, was the element that required the most careful reverse engineering from the medical data, then the delivery architecture, which was the hardest problem of all. We worked in overlapping shifts. We had disagreements that were sometimes heated and always, eventually, resolved by going back to the data. We discarded weeks of modeling when new findings made the previous model wrong, and we discarded them without sentiment, because being wrong is more expensive than the weeks. The field mechanism resolved in month 4. It was a coherence dissolution effect operating in a frequency band we had not previously catalogued in any natural or artificial phenomenon. A narrow band, precisely defined, that resonated destructively with a very specific molecular structure found in human, higher neural binding tissue and essentially nowhere else in any biological system we were aware of. This was the Vakarath's most significant technical achievement in the instrument's design, not the power of the field, which was moderate by the standards of known weapons, but the precision of the tuning. They had identified the exact resonance frequency of the relevant human neural structures, which required not only a complete biological analysis of human neural architecture, but a sufficiently advanced computational model to predict the resonance behavior of those structures under field exposure. They had done this work. They had done it carefully. The field was tuned with a precision that bordered on artistry, and I use that word deliberately, because I found, in the 4th month of our work, that I could appreciate the engineering, even while holding in a separate room the 4 million people it had been used on. The targeting mechanism, The question of how the Vakarath had achieved the tuning specificity across the full range of human biological variation resolved in month 7, largely through the medical data. The instrument did not operate at a uniform frequency. It swept a precise band continuously during the 19-minute window, maintaining coherence-dissolution conditions across the full biological distribution of higher neural binding tissue types found in humans. This required a real-time computational adjustment as the field propagated, which meant the instrument was not a simple radiating device but a self-adjusting one, reading and responding to the biological landscape of the planetary surface as it swept it. This was sophisticated. It was also, once understood, reproducible. The delivery architecture took until month 11 to resolve, and it was the problem that required the most creative thinking from the team, because we had the least direct data about it. What we knew from the sensor recording was that the field had originated from ground level, not from orbit, not from a ship in transit, but from the surface of each affected world. This implied pre-positioned hardware, delivery nodes placed on the target worlds before the deployment event. The logistics of doing this covertly across 38 human worlds implied either a very long preparation timeline or an extraordinary intelligence operation, or both, and the Vakarath had the capability for both. What we did not know for most of those months was how the nodes had been activated simultaneously across 38 systems. The signals architecture that had triggered them all within the same 19-minute window, despite the light speed separation between the systems. The answer to that was the materials specialists, and it came in month 9, at 0300 in the commissary. On notation paper she preferred to screens for first draft thinking. She came and got me because the answer touched my section directly, and I sat across from her at the commissary table while she walked me through it. The Vakarath had used a subspace carrier channel, a very narrow, very specific frequency within the Coalition's own commercial communications infrastructure, as the trigger signal. The channel was indistinguishable from a routine compact commercial data packet. It had passed through every Coalition signal monitoring system in the network without flagging because it looked like commercial traffic. It was not commercial traffic. It was a precisely coded activation sequence that the ground nodes were designed to recognize and respond to, and when it came through, they had woken up and done their work. I checked her math twice that morning. Then I went back to my cot and slept for 6 hours, which was the longest uninterrupted sleep I had managed since arriving at Null 7. I do not think the sleep was avoidance. I think it was a kind of deliberate pause, a few hours of acknowledgement before the door that had been in front of us for 9 months opened. When I woke up, we briefed the full team, and the team spent 3 days checking everything, and when it held, we briefed Director Adu, and Adu spent 2 days with the Defense Secretary's office. On the 4th day, orders came through the secure channel. The orders did not say what they were authorizing in explicit language. They did not need to. The authorization package that accompanied them was detailed and referenced the Coalition Defense Council's session of 2 weeks earlier, which had run 11 hours and had produced a decision that the authorization package ratified through layers of legal review I was given access to, read but not to quote from. What the package authorized, in effect, was the following. Using the technical knowledge developed at Null 7, produce a functional reproduction of the stillness instrument at whatever deployment scale the Council had determined appropriate. I learned the scale from the engineering specifications that arrived with the orders, because the specifications had to account for the number of targets, and the number of targets was in the specifications. The Vakarath Dominion had 411 inhabited worlds. The specifications called for a deployment architecture covering all 411 of them simultaneously, in the same 19-minute window the Vakarath had used. There is a question embedded in that number that I want to address directly, because I believe in addressing things directly. The question is whether 411 worlds was proportionate to what had been done to 38. The answer is no. Not in the arithmetic sense. 411 is not 38, and the Vakarath's 38 worlds that had been used for the original deployment was a number defined by their targeting logic, not by some claim to moral equivalence. The Coalition Defense Council, in the session I was not present for, had not sought arithmetic equivalence. They had sought something different, completeness. The Vakarath Dominion had acted as a dominion, unified at every level of its government, from the engineering teams that built the instrument to the diplomatic division that filed 4 million people as inventory without apparent internal dissent. There was no faction within the Dominion that had protested, leaked, or resisted. The Coalition's response was to address the Dominion as what it was, complete. Not 38 of its 411 worlds. All of them. The scale was the message. It was not rage. It was not punitive in the way a sentence of pain is punitive. It was a mirror, sized to fit the thing it was reflecting back. The Vakarath had used their instrument on 38 human worlds and turned 4 million of our people into something they could file under Article 7 null. The Coalition was going to use the Vakarath's own instrument on every world they had. Not because we had lost count or were beyond caring about proportionality, but because the Dominion was not a sub-faction or a rogue element or a mistake that could be corrected by addressing part of it. It was the entity that had done the thing, in full, and the response would address it in full. I signed the certification. All 12 of us did. The materials specialist signed. Her name is on the certification document in the compact archive, and it will be there for as long as the archive exists. The construction phase lasted 4 months. The Wrath Meridian assembled in 6 separate outer orbital staging locations across as many systems, never more than 65 warships in any single location at any time. Each group logged in Coalition navigation records as routine patrol formations or maintenance clusters. The fleet that eventually came together was 388,000 warships. They carried the rebuilt instrument in a modified orbital deployment configuration, the node architecture adjusted for delivery from orbit rather than from the surface, using resonance propagation modeling that the team at Null 7 had developed in months 12 and 13 as an extension of the original ground node analysis. The orbital configuration was harder to place covertly than ground nodes, but it did not require the years of pre-positioning that the Vakarath's architecture had needed. Because warships in formation are a different kind of delivery vehicle than ground nodes and operate on a different timeline entirely. We had used the Vakarath's own communications architecture, the subspace carrier channel they had embedded in the Coalition's commercial infrastructure, as the basis for the activation signal. That required some modification to handle the scale, but the underlying approach was theirs, derived from the hardware analysis at Null 7. We were giving it back to them in more ways than one. I was aboard the EFS Null 7's Answer during the transit and the deployment. The ship was a mid-class tactical vessel, not the flagship. Fleet Admiral Kiona Tassi commanded the Wrath Meridian from the EFS First Reckoning. My assignment aboard the Null 7's Answer was technical oversight, which in practice meant I was the senior person on that ship with a complete understanding of what we were deploying, and my function was to be available if any technical question arose during the operation that required someone who had built the thing to answer it. No such question arose. The team had done the work correctly, and the systems performed as designed, which is what happens when you do the work correctly. The bridge of the Null 7's Answer was quiet during the transit. Not the taut, anxious quiet of people waiting for a battle they are frightened of, but the settled quiet of people who have been fully briefed and have accepted the reality of what they are part of and are now simply doing their jobs. The crew was professional in the way that Coalition naval personnel are trained to be professional, which is without theater, without performance, without any of the posturing that untrained people sometimes mistake for military bearing. They knew what the fleet was going to do. They had known since before we left the staging area. They had read the same authorization package I had read, in the version cleared for crew distribution, and they had had the time during transit to arrive wherever they needed to arrive with it. Fleet Admiral Tassi's address to the assembled fleet came the evening before the deployment window, 11 minutes. I have read the transcript. It is in the compact archive, and what I remember most clearly about it is its absence of rhetoric. She did not invoke the dead in any sentimental way. She did not make promises about what the operation would mean for history or for the Coalition's future. She described the offense, the 38 worlds, the 19 minutes, the 4,142,000 people who were still alive and still silent. She described the response, the 411 worlds, the same 19 minutes, the same instrument, applied in full. She stated that the Defense Council had authorized the operation under Emergency Provision 7 of the Mutual Defense Charter and that the legal review had been complete. She said, "The operation is lawful, it is exact, it is final." Then she ended the communication. We were quiet after that. I was quiet. The bridge crew was quiet. We stayed that way until morning. The deployment window opened on schedule. The fleet's timing coordination used the same subspace carrier method we had adapted from the Vakarath's original architecture, which meant all 411 target engagements began within milliseconds of each other. the activation signal traveling the fleet's distributed formation and reaching every deployment node within a window too narrow to measure by conventional means. The field went out. The 19 minutes ran. I watched the timer on the secondary display to the left of the navigation officer's station. Green numerals, counting down. The bridge was very still. No one spoke. At minute 11, the communications officer reported an incoming transmission on the compact diplomatic channel, the standard channel, the one the Vakarath's legal division had used 6 hours after their deployment to file 4 million people under Article 7 null. The communications officer looked at the captain, who looked at me, because the standing orders about incoming Vakarath transmissions during the operation were in the authorization package, and I was the senior technical officer present. I said log it and route it to archive. That was what the standing orders said. The transmission was logged and archived. At minute 15, another transmission came through the diplomatic channel, logged and archived. At minute 19, the timer reached 0. The navigation officer reported nominal completion across all assigned targets in our sector. Over the next 4 minutes, completion reports came in from every other sector of the fleet. 388,000 warships, 411 worlds, 19 minutes. Fleet Admiral Tassie's voice came over the fleet-wide channel. 3 words, the same cadence as everything else she had said since taking command of the formation. Wrath Meridian complete. The crew of the Null 7's answer acknowledged in the way trained crews acknowledge, a murmur of confirmation at each station, the necessary entries in the operational log, the transition to post-deployment status procedures. The captain, Commander Hilo Ave, stood at the center of the bridge for a moment after the confirmation was complete, and then walked to the viewport and looked out at the Vakarath world visible through it, pale amber in its daylit hemisphere, the cloud bands catching the system's primary star in long curving streaks of white light. He stood there for perhaps 30 seconds. Then he turned around and went back to his station and resumed his duties. I have been asked what I felt at the moment the timer reached 0. The question is legitimate, and I have tried over the years since to answer it honestly rather than in the way that sounds right. What I felt was not satisfaction in any uncomplicated sense. It was not triumph. It was something closer to a kind of stillness, which I recognize is a word I am not using accidentally, a condition of finality, of completion, of a thing that has been building for 14 months, reaching the moment where it stops building and becomes simply what it is. The 4,142,000 people on the 38 human worlds were still silent. Nothing the Wrath Meridian had done changed that. Nothing was going to change that. What had been done to them was permanent, and so was what we had done in response. And both of those facts sat together in the same place, and I held them both without trying to resolve them into something simpler. The Vakarath transmitted 5 times in the 72 hours of the post-deployment hold. The first was the one received at minute 11, formal high diplomatic register, requesting immediate cessation of hostile action, invoking Compact Article 19 remediation, requesting an emergency arbitration session, and the appointment of a neutral mediating council to assess proportionality. The second was the one at minute 15, shorter, plainer register, requesting confirmation of the operation's scope, and asking whether the coalition intended to transmit terms of engagement for a cessation of hostilities. The third came at hour 9 of the hold, plainest register of all, no legal preamble, requesting medical consultation and coordination for the Vakarath population, and asking what protocols the coalition intended to apply for their care. The fourth and fifth came at hours 27 and 51, variations on the same request. None of them received a response. This was not negligence. The authorization package had addressed the question of communications explicitly, with reasoning that I found, after reading it carefully, to be correct. The Vakarath's original Article 7 null notification had rested on a classification system. The distinction between entities with protected compact standing and entities without it, that the Vakarath had applied to 4 million human beings on the grounds that those beings had been rendered non-responsive by the instrument and therefore no longer met the threshold for protected status. The coalition's position was that to transmit anything in response to Vakarath communications, any terms, any protocols, any acknowledgement at all, would be to operate within the same framework the Vakarath had used. To treat the exchange as one between parties with compact standing and obligations, which would implicitly accept the Vakarath's classification system as valid. The coalition did not accept it. The Coalition's communication to the Vakarath had been made through the only channel that was not a legal fiction, the instrument itself, returned at scale. We did not file the Vakarath under Article 7 null. We did not file them under any compact provision. We did not reclassify them as non-responsive inventory or non-signatory biological units or any of the language the Vakarath's legal division had used. We did not attempt to establish custodial standing over their people. What we had done was not a mirror of their administrative action. It was a mirror of their weapon. We had given back the stillness, exactly as built, to every world they had, and we had not filed anything, because filing them would have meant accepting that filing was the right framework for what had happened between us. And it was not, and we refused to let it be. During the 72-hour hold, I wrote the technical report. I wrote it in the forward compartment of the Null 7's answer, at a desk that was too small and bolted to a wall that had a faint vibration from the nearest thruster array, and I wrote it in the technical register my field requires, which is precise and free of feeling, not because feeling is absent, but because the register has no place for it and does not need one. The report covered the instrument's mechanism as we had understood it, the reproduction process at Null 7, the modified orbital deployment architecture, and the operational outcome. It was a thorough document. I have read it since in its declassified portions, and I believe it remains accurate. The last section was a terminology note. I had carried the translation of the Vakarath name for the instrument since month 2 at Null 7, when one of our physicists had photographed the script stamped into the recovered relay node hardware, and a Coalition linguistics officer at Meridian Station had translated it. The translation had sat in my working notes for 12 months. The technical report was the right place to put it. The Vakarath's compound noun. The condition of having been made quiet. The state of no longer being a problem. I noted in the terminology section that the Coalition had chosen not to rename the weapon at any point during the 14 months of development, on the grounds that the Vakarath's own designation was accurate and complete, and that no improvement on it was available or appropriate. The report noted that the Wrath Meridian had deployed the Vakarath's instrument, as designed, to all 411 of the Dominion's inhabited worlds using a delivery architecture derived from the Dominion's own ground node approach. In the same 19-minute window the Dominion had used on the 38 human worlds, and that the Coalition had transmitted no accompanying filing or legal designation to the Vakarath diplomatic channel before, during, or after the deployment. I noted, in the report's final paragraph, that the Coalition had not developed a new weapon. The Coalition had developed a complete understanding of the Vakarath's weapon and returned it. I filed the report on the 68th hour of the hold. It went into the compact archive alongside the Article 7 null notification. The full engineering documentation from Null 7, the operational logs of the Wrath Meridian, and the 5 Vakarath transmissions received during the hold, none of which had received a response. The archive was constructed to be complete and navigable by any future arbitration proceeding or historical review. If there was ever a question about what had happened and why and in what order, the record would be unambiguous. What followed in the 18 months after the Wrath Meridian is a matter of public compact record, and I will not spend much time on it here. The Vakarath Dominion's compact standing was suspended pending arbitration review. The Dominion's governing council, operating with a significantly reduced capacity for reasons that the deployment had directly produced, was unable to conduct its normal administrative and legal functions at anything approaching the previous pace, which meant that a great many things the Dominion had previously done, including maintaining the legal infrastructure that had supported the Article 7 null filing, became functionally inoperative for an extended period. The arbitration review ran for 3 years. I was called to provide technical testimony twice. Both times I told the arbitration panel what I have told you here, in approximately the same words. And both times I was asked whether I believed the deployment had been proportionate, and both times I gave the same answer, which was that proportionality was a legal concept that the panel was better qualified than I was to assess, and that what I could tell them was that the deployment was exact. The same instrument, the same window, applied by the Coalition with the same precision the Vakarath had applied it with, and not modified or added to in any way. The arbitration's conclusions, when they were issued, were long and carefully worded, and I have read them in full. I will not characterize them beyond saying that they exist, and that the relevant portions are accessible in the public compact archive. I went back to my desk at the Directorate after the mission, and after my 2 testimony appearances, and after the declassification review that cleared the portions of my work I was permitted to discuss, my clearance was adjusted. My file was updated with the standard notation for personnel involved in classified operations, a notation that tells anyone with appropriate access that there is more than the visible record contains, without specifying what the more is. I could not describe my work at Null 7 in any non-secured context for a number of years. People who asked what I had been doing during that period received a version of the truth that was accurate as far as it went. Classified field assignment, recovered technology assessment, extended duration. No one pressed very hard. It was not the kind of answer that invited pressing. The 4,142,000 people on the 38 human worlds are still silent. I want to say that plainly, at the end of this account, because it would be easy to read what I have written as a story with a satisfying resolution, and it is not that. The Coalition Medical and Recovery Division maintains care operations on all 38 worlds. The work is ongoing and will be ongoing for as long as the people involved are alive, which is likely to be a normal human lifespan. The instrument's effect was permanent, but not degenerative, and the people it reached have the biological machinery for a full life expectancy, and so the care work extends across that full span. There are people on those worlds who were children at the time of the deployment and who are now adults who have never spoken. There are families that have reorganized themselves entirely around a member who was present in the morning and irretrievably changed by afternoon. The care work is real and important and not enough, because enough is not a category that applies to 4,142,000 people who cannot tell you whether they remember who they were. This is what I hold alongside everything else. I hold it without trying to resolve it into something simpler, because it does not resolve. The response was exact. The instrument was returned. The accounting was complete. None of that changes what happened on the 38 worlds on the 14th of 2291, and none of it was meant to. It was not a reversal or a restoration. It was a closure, not of the wound, which does not close, but of the open question of what the coalition would do about the civilization that had sent the instrument, and that question is closed. The Vakarath called it the stillness instrument, the condition of having been made quiet, the state of no longer being a problem. It is a precise enough name for what it does. It was precise when they sent it to 38 human worlds, and it remained precise when we sent it to 411 of theirs. We used their name for it. We thought that was appropriate. I should say something more about the work itself, because I have described it at a level of abstraction that does not fully honor what 14 months inside Null 7 actually was. The abstraction is honest. It is how I experience the work from the inside, because the inside of technical work is mostly method and problem, not drama or epiphany, but it elides the texture of the days in ways that I think matter for anyone trying to understand how something like the Wrath Meridian comes into existence. It does not come from a decision made in an 11-hour council session, though that decision was real and necessary. It comes from 12 people in a decommissioned dry dock, in fluorescent light that was slightly too cold, eating commissary food that was adequate but monotonous, sleeping on cots that were coalition standard and not comfortable, doing very hard work for a very long time without any guarantee that the very hard work would result in anything that functioned. The first month was almost entirely diagnostic. We were not yet building anything. We were building the instruments we would eventually use to understand what we were dealing with, the analytical framework, the measurement approach, the set of questions in the right order. This sounds straightforward from outside, but from inside, it is the most difficult part of any reverse engineering project, because you do not yet know what you do not know, and the things you do not know are what will cost you the most time later. You guess wrong about them now. We spent 4 weeks in argument about how to approach the spectral signature data from the survey vessel, what level of analysis to prioritize, how much of the biological data set was reliable given the environmental variation across 38 worlds, how to weight the physical hardware fragments against the field data. These were arguments between people who were right in different ways, which is the hardest kind of argument because no one is wrong and so no one can be conclusively overruled. We resolved them through the least glamorous method available. We tried things. We ran the analysis multiple ways, compared results, looked for convergences, and built our model around the convergences. There was a week in month 3 that I remember clearly because it was the week we nearly went wrong in a way that would have cost us months. One of the physicists, Dr. Ren Sato, whose name I include because he is deceased now and cannot ask me not to, developed a model of the field's coherence mechanism that was elegant and internally consistent and, as we discovered when we tested it against the full biological dataset, incorrect. The model predicted that the instrument's tuning would have produced a different distribution of effect intensity across the 38 worlds than the medical data showed, not dramatically different, but measurably so, enough to be a real discrepancy. Sato spent 3 days trying to reconcile the discrepancy within his model before accepting that the model was wrong. I watched him do this because I was working at an adjacent station during those 3 days, and the kind of mental work Sato was doing is visible to another engineer in the way that internal processes generally are not. You can see the moments when the math goes down a path and comes back, the subtle recalibrations, the increments of increasing certainty that the path is closed. When he finally set the model aside and said the 4 words that are the hardest words in technical work, I got it wrong. The rest of us received it without comment, which is the correct response. He built a new model. The new model worked. I think about Sato sometimes. He was 53 years old during those 14 months at Null 7, a theoretical physicist from a research institution I am not going to name here, compact and quiet, with a precise way of eating commissary food that suggested someone who had spent decades in research environments and had made a private accommodation with their nutritional adequacy. He had no family on the 38 worlds. He was there. He told me once, we were the only 2 people still awake in the commissary at 0200 in month 6, because he had spent 30 years building theories about field resonance mechanics, and the Vakarath had built a device that represented either the most sophisticated application of field resonance principles he had ever encountered, or a fundamental challenge to his theoretical framework. And he needed to know which. He needed to know how they had done it. The answer to that question was, for him, primary. What we would do with the answer was secondary, not because he was indifferent to the 4 million people in the medical dataset, but because his mind worked in a way that made him most useful through the purely technical question, and he understood that about himself and allocated his attention accordingly. He died of a cardiac event in his sleep in month 13, 6 weeks before the deployment. He never saw the Rath Meridian assemble. The certification document has his name on it from month 12, when we had completed enough of the scaled deployment modeling to certify the core architecture. I think he would have found the 411 world deployment architecturally elegant, which is a thing you can find true about a response at that scale without it being the whole of what you think about it. The material specialist's breakthrough at 0300 in month 9 was not as sudden as I have made it sound in the compressed version of events. It was the culmination of 4 months of work she had been doing, alongside the main team, but largely independently, following a thread of analysis that the rest of us had allocated lower priority, because we had assessed the delivery architecture as secondary to the field mechanism in the sequencing of problems. She had not fully agreed with that assessment, but had accepted it as the team's consensus and worked on higher priority items accordingly, while keeping the delivery architecture question running in the background. A separate track of thinking she had maintained through the months when her primary attention was on other things. When she came to get me at 0300, it was because the background track had resolved into something she could write down in full, and she needed someone to check it immediately, before she went back to bed, because it was the kind of result that does not let you go back to bed without being verified. We sat across from each other at the commissary table for 2 hours. She had the notation paper in front of her, 3 sheets, dense with her handwriting, which was small and precise and slightly left-leaning in a way that suggested she had at some point deliberately trained herself toward a different style and had not fully arrived at it. I worked through the derivation from the beginning. The carrier channel approach was not something I would have thought of, which is not a failing in my technical training so much as a difference in how our minds were shaped by different years of work. I thought about field physics, she thought about signal propagation and materials behavior, and the delivery problem was fundamentally a signal propagation problem rather than a physics problem, which is why the team's higher priority sequencing had been wrong and her background track had been right. The math held. The channel signature she had identified in the Vakarath's activation data matched the commercial traffic profile so exactly that I went back through the original monitoring division data from the deployment event and found the packet, the actual carrier signal, logged and not flagged, sitting in a coalition commercial routing database from the morning of the 14th, 11 hours before the monitoring division had realized anything was wrong. It had been there the whole time. I did not wake anyone else at 0300. The work would still be correct at 0600. We went back to our cots and I slept 6 hours and came back to the commissary and found the materials specialist already there with a fresh cup of coffee and her 3 sheets of notation paper, reading them again, and we both knew from the other's face that the check had held. Building the scaled architecture in the final 3 months was the most technically demanding phase, because everything we had learned had to be translated from understanding into construction. And construction, at the scale of 411 worlds, operating simultaneously, introduced engineering tolerances that the original Vakarath design had not needed to address. Their deployment had been sequential at the activation level, a single signal triggering pre-positioned nodes across 38 worlds. Ours was simultaneous at the firing level, 388,000 warships, each carrying orbital deployment nodes, each needing to initiate within a synchronization window narrow enough to ensure that no Vakarath world received advance warning from another. The synchronization problem required a solution that the Vakarath's architecture had not needed to solve, because their 38 worlds were spread across a region where subspace carrier propagation gave them adequate coherence. But 411 worlds across the full extent of Vakarath space required a modified approach. The modification was the Naval Systems Engineers, the one from Propulsion Systems, whose name was Adjunct Engineer Peta Lavulo, and I include her name because she was 29 years old during those 14 months, and she solved the hardest new problem in the entire project, and she deserves to be on the record. She adapted a propulsion field synchronization protocol that the Coalition Navy used for formation flying maneuvers at scale and showed us how it could be applied to the activation signal architecture with a modification that required 3 weeks of testing to certify and then worked exactly as she said it would. We certified the architecture in month 13, 1 week after Sato's death. The certification document has 12 names on it. The deployment went forward. The rest is what I have described. I will say one more thing, which I have not said in any other account of this that I have given. It has to do with the Vakarath's name for the weapon, and what that name means in the context of what has happened since. The stillness instrument. The condition of having been made quiet. The state of no longer being a problem. When I first encountered the translation in month 2 at Null 7, my reaction was revulsion at its clinical self-satisfaction. The way quiet and not a problem were treated as synonymous. As if the only relevant question about a person's silence was what category of administrative burden they now represented. I carried that revulsion with me through the 14 months as a quiet background signal, not loud enough to interfere with the work, but present. What changed in the final months? Not because of anything specific that happened, but because of the accumulation of time spent inside the instruments. Says architecture, understanding it from the inside, was not the revulsion, but my understanding of why the Vakarath had found their own name for it. Adequate. They had not experienced the gap between quiet and not a problem as a gap because in the framework their civilization operated in, silence and non-problemness were, for the categories of entities they applied the instrument to, genuinely identical concepts. An entity that was silent was one that was not taking up space in the administrative landscape, not filing, not requesting, not transmitting, not asserting standing. For the Vakarath, the relevant characteristic of a person was their participation in the information and legal systems that constituted, in Vakarath thinking, the actual fabric of the civilized world. Remove that participation, and you had, in their framework, removed the thing that made the person a person in the relevant sense. What remained was biology. Biology could be filed. It was all very clean and internally consistent, and it was the logical endpoint of a civilization that had made legal and informational standing the ground of personhood, without noticing or caring that the people it was applied to had a different understanding of what made them people. We used their name for the weapon because their name was accurate, and we did not intend to pretend otherwise. The instrument made things quiet. It was designed to. We built it exactly as they had, and we returned it exactly as built. And the silence it made on 411 worlds was the same silence it had made on 38. And we did not file any of it, because filing would have been a lie about what the silence meant. The 4,142,000 are still breathing. The work continues. The Vakarath called it the stillness instrument, and they were right to. And I carry that name with me the same way I carry everything else from those 14 months. Precisely, without resolution, in a room by itself where I can see it clearly from a distance that allows me to keep working. That is all I have to say about it.